Hi, I am Elizna van Westhuizen from the Accounting Standards Board, and this recording is an overview of a guideline published by our board on accounting for landfill sites. I do just want to make you aware that the recording is going to be done in two separate recordings, so please have a look at both of them to get the full presentation, or else if you're only interested in a part of the presentation, you're welcome to just have a look at that part. Then I also just want to note that there is a lot of detail that I have included in the slides, but I'm not going to go through all of that in the interest of providing you with a brief overview in the recording. The slides are also available on our website, so should you be interested to read it in your own time, then please access it on our website. Then if you do have any questions about the recording, then you're also welcome to contact us info@asb.co.za, and we'd be happy to assist you with any questions that you may have. So without further ado, I do just have a brief disclaimer, which is standard for our presentations, to let you know that what I'm going to share with you today is my individual views and interpretation of the guideline. It's not any official position of the board, but please note that the guideline has been approved by the board and published by the board. What I'm going to share with you is factual from the guideline, so just to make that clear. So next, what the content is that we're going to look at today. I'm just going to quickly give you an overview of the objective and the scope of the guideline. We will then have a look of what the life cycle of a typical landfill site looks like. And then the accounting considerations are dealt with in three separate sections, the three different parts of the landfill site separately. So first we'll look at land, then we'll look at the landfill site asset and the rehabilitation provision lastly. We also do have a few other considerations that I'll very briefly share with you. And then lastly, how do you apply the guideline for the first time? We'll also briefly have a look at that. So the way in which I'm going to do the two recordings is, firstly, we are going to deal with the objective, the life cycle, and then the accounting considerations for land and the landfill site asset. In the second recording, I'll be dealing with the rehabilitation provision, the other considerations, and applying the guideline. So let's have a look first at the objective and the scope of the guideline. So the objective is, maybe I should start by saying that there is a divergence in practice in how entities account for landfill sites, and it's also a very highly regulated environment. So because of this inconsistent practices that existed, the board wanted to provide some guidance to bring uniformity and comparability among entities. The board also wanted to make sure that entities are aware of what the information is they need to provide to users in financial statements, so that users get the information they need from the financial statements. I do want to just highlight the status of this document, or the authority of this document. Because it is a guideline, it means that the board prescribes through Directive 5 whether it's mandatory or not. So the board has included this guideline on accounting for landfill sites within Directive 5 as part of the GRAP reporting framework. Therefore, entities do need to comply with the guideline. Just on the effective date of this, it is not yet effective. The Minister of Finance must still determine the effective date. That's now at the time of this recording. So it is linked to the effective date of improvements to the standards of GRAP for 2020. Therefore, please have a look out for what the final gazette is that the Minister is going to publish for what the effective date of this guideline will be, alongside the improvements to the standards of GRAP. Just to note that we have proposed 1 April 2021, but due to the timing of it not yet being approved, we are now in May 2021. We suspect that it will be 1 April 2022. Because the guideline does not introduce any new requirements, it is simply interpreting and explaining the existing requirements in the standards of GRAP. The entities may now already develop their accounting policies in accordance with the guideline and align their accounting policies. If it's not already aligned, it may very well already be aligned. So let's look at the scope quickly. As I mentioned, this is a highly regulated environment, and therefore there are a number of different pieces of legislation that entities need to comply with when it comes to accounting for landfill sites. Most, I guess, well known would be the National Environmental Management Waste Act, which is just referred to as the Waste Act. There's also the National Environmental Act. There's related regulations, and then also something that's referred to as the minimum requirements that's been issued. Previously, the minimum requirements were not, they were just guidelines, but through the Waste Act and the license conditions that many entities are required to comply with, these minimum requirements do become then part of what we see as legislation governing landfill sites. So I do just on the scope of the guideline want to highlight that the guideline has very clearly been written with the existing legislation in mind to make sure that the guidance we provide would mean it would apply to those entities that comply with legislation. We do also know that there are older landfill sites that have different requirements. They maybe are not required to comply with all the requirements as we have interpreted for the guideline. And in that case, you may then apply the guideline, but just be mindful of where those differences may be between what you are required to comply with and what the legislation is that we've considered for the guideline. So I do not want to go into the detail of all the legislated requirements today, but please have a look at Chapter 1 of the guideline where that is set out. Then if you do have another sort of rehabilitation provision that's not related to landfill sites, but that works similarly, then you are welcome to apply the guideline by analogy. But again, be very mindful where there are differences in legislated requirements compared to what we have used for developing the guideline. So it does apply to all entities that are required to comply with the legislation, and it also applies to general and hazardous waste. The life cycle of the landfill site is a slide that I just quickly want to share with you. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but this is the typical life cycle that we have interpreted from the legislated requirements. So I think just as an introduction, there may be differences in your specific requirements for your site, and in that case, you would have to alter the picture a little bit for your scenario. And the requirements that we are going to discuss today is based on these various phases of the landfill site cycle. So therefore, just keep those differences in mind when you read the guideline. So we do have the first step, which is the license for operation of a landfill site. There is an application that needs to be made to the licensed authority to operate a landfill site. There are certain studies that need to be done before that initial application, and that would be things like a feasibility study with a feasibility reporting. Once you have received the next step then is for the licensing authority to grant you permission to apply to obtain the license. So that would be the next step. That's quite an important step that we are going to look at a bit later as well. The next phase would then be the phase within which the landfill site is being operated and therefore receiving waste and complying with the requirements. Then once the landfill site has reached its capacity, we get to the stage of closure of the landfill site. So there's another application process here with the licensing authority. After closure of the landfill site, the next phase would be the rehabilitation period, again governed by your licensing conditions and legislation. Once the site has been rehabilitated, there are certain activities that still need to occur. So for one, there may be an end-use plan that's implemented at that stage. And while that is going on, there would be a monitoring and inspection period of up to 30 years. So this is an example of an area where your requirements may be a little bit different. Interpreting the legislation, we think it would be 30 years, but in your case, it may be less or more. Then I also just want to mention that some of these things can happen concurrently. So maybe you can only implement your end-use plan after your what we refer to as after rehabilitation monitoring inspection period of 30 years. But in other circumstances, maybe those two things can happen at the same time. So you would just need to take that into consideration. So with that as an overview, I want to just quickly remind you again for the accounting considerations, we are going to look at the land in a landfill as well as the landfill site assets, and that will be the end of the first recording. Then we are going to look at the rehabilitation provision in the second recording. So let's start with accounting for land in a landfill site. I am actually not going to go through this in a lot of detail. I think you would be familiar with the requirements already. So what is key here is that you do need to separate your land in a landfill site from your landfill site asset. In accordance with GRAP 17, property, plant and equipment, land and other related assets are separate and do need to be accounted for separately. So when it comes to the recognition of land, it is when the definition and recognition criteria are met. We do have an interpretation of the standards of GRAP on recognition and derecognition of land, IGRAP 18. So IGRAP 18 determines the criteria that you need to keep in mind to know when you can recognize or when you need to derecognize land. I'm not going to go through that in detail today, but please refer to IGRAP 18. So as far as the classification goes, land in a landfill site does meet the definition of property, plant and equipment. It is used to provide a service, and that would be a landfill, a service, waste disposal activities, and it is expected to be used during more than one reporting period. So landfill sites land will be classified as property, plant and equipment. You may need to reclassify it if it was previously something else. So maybe you had land that was classified as investment property before, then you are going to just reclassify that, applying the requirements in GRAP 17 and in this case, if it was investment property, GRAP 16 respectively. I did mention to you before on the life cycle of the landfill site that you could, at the end of the landfill site, when you implement the end-use plan, then have a different use for this landfill site. So you may need to reclassify the land again, depending on what you are going to use it for as part of your end-use plan. So initial measurement, in terms of GRAP 17, the normal requirements apply. So I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail. I think just one thing to mention is where you do reclassify it from a different type of asset, so maybe from investment property to GRAP 17 property, plant and equipment, there may be some of the impairment indicators in GRAP 21 and GRAP 26 that could be triggered, that may require you to, on initial reclassification and initial measurement in GRAP 17, account for an impairment. So one of the indicators is a significant long-term change that will have an adverse effect on the extent or the manner that the asset is used or expected to be used. So I think you can see how that could be applicable here. Subsequent measurement, normal requirement in terms of GRAP 17 cost or revaluation method. Because land has an unlimited useful life, it is not depreciated. So I think that was one thing that came out of developing the guideline for us. And this is also the reason why the effective date of the guideline is linked to the improvements to the standards of GRAP of 2020. There is in previous versions of GRAP 17 an example where if land is used for landfilling, it may have a limited useful life. But I think in debating what it really is and what you are getting out of land, the board realized land always has an unlimited useful life. After you have rehabilitated and implemented the end-use plan, it is going to continue to provide you with service potential or even potentially economic benefits if you use it for something else afterwards. So what really happens is you may have an impairment, but you do not lose the fact that you have an unlimited period over which you can use land. So this is the last slide on land that I wanted to share with you. And again, I want to just remind you about IGRAP 18. So the next section is guidance on accounting for the landfill site asset. So this is really one of the core elements of accounting for landfill sites. So we will spend a few minutes on this and going through this in a bit more detail. Firstly, the recognition and the classification of the landfill site asset. So I think maybe just to start by noting that a landfill site asset could be acquired or it could be developed. And I think what we've heard in developing the guideline is that more often than not, landfill sites are developed. They are not really acquired that often. So you do have potentially a number of different individual costs that you are going to incur, and you are going to have to assess how to recognize, classify, measure, and so on, all of these different elements that make up your landfill site asset. So that's what the next few slides is going to consider. So firstly, when we look at recognition, you are familiar with the recognition criteria as well as the definition of an asset. So in the guideline, putting those two together, the board did highlight that you will probably be able to recognize when you have an enforceable right to the asset and to the probable future economic benefits or service potential that is generated by providing this waste disposal service or activity to your residents. You must be able to determine the nature, the type, and the volume of the waste disposal activities that will be provided with this landfill site asset, and also to be able to determine to whom and at what price. So if you have those sort of powers within your mandate or in your the rights that you have, then it indicates that you can recognize and you have control. The other aspect of control is directing the use of this landfill site asset. So if you are the party that can decide to use this landfill site asset either yourself or to direct another party to do this landfill activity or waste disposal activity on your behalf, that's another indicator that you control this landfill site asset. And then lastly, the cost or fair value must be reliably measurable. So in that case, you can recognize. We will look in the coming slides what it is that we're talking about that you can recognize. So similar to land, it is classified as PP&E. I'm not really going to talk about that a lot. So let's look at measurement. The same principles from GRAP 17 applies, that you are initially measuring it at cost. If it's in a non-exchange transaction, so let's say you do get a landfill site, a completed landfill site that you receive in a non-exchange transaction, then it's at fair value. This could also apply perhaps to some of the elements or the components of the cost if you are developing and constructing a landfill site asset. So where you are in the scenario of developing and constructing a landfill site asset, the board had to determine what is the point that you most likely will be able to say that you meet the recognition criteria and that you are going to capitalize the cost that you have incurred. There are different phases, like we saw when we looked at the landfill site life cycle. So at which point can you start to capitalize? What the board established by looking at legislation and hearing from our stakeholders, the board decided that it will be that point where you have received approval from the licensing authority to commence with your license application report. So costs before that, you would likely not be able to say meets the recognition criteria, so you are going to expense them. And this would be, for example, those feasibility studies and the feasibility report that we saw on the life cycle slide. So anything after that point where you receive approval from the authority would be potentially capitalized, but you do still need to consider whether you meet certain criteria in order to capitalize costs after that point, and you need to apply judgment. So the criteria that we have in the guideline is, in addition to the accounting policies that an entity would have that meets the requirements of the standards of GRAP. So again, it's not really anything new, but just explicit in the context of landfill sites. So what you consider is probable future economic benefits or service potential from the landfill site. Technical feasibility, and this means that it is technically feasible that the licensing authority is going to approve the license for operation of the site so that it will be available for use, and it links to probable future economic benefits and service potential. Then also that the entity has or will have the ability to complete the site and use it for waste disposal activities once approval has been obtained. Then fourthly, there must be adequate technical, financial, as well as other resources within the entity's realm to complete the development and the construction of the asset, as well as to undertake the rehabilitation and monitoring costs that are going to have to be incurred. So you do think about the whole life cycle of the landfill site. And then lastly, you must be able to reliably measure these expenditure and these costs that you are incurring in order to measure them reliably and to recognize them. So just also in the normal GRAP 17 requirements, you are ceasing capitalization when the asset is in location and in the condition necessary to operate in the manner intended by management. So that is nothing different from the normal requirements in GRAP 17, just applying it to landfill sites. So in GRAP 17, there are three different elements to the cost of a landfill site asset. The first one is the purchase price. So that would be the cash price equivalent for which you are procuring a landfill site asset. Where there is deferred payment, then potentially you have interest. I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail, but that mostly applies to the scenario where you are acquiring a completed landfill site asset. The next portion of the cost, or the element of the cost, is directly attributable costs. So this usually applies, or this does apply, where you are constructing or developing your landfill site asset and you are incurring a range of different elements of costs of developing this landfill site asset. So you are going to decide which of those can you capitalize to the cost. You are going to apply judgment. So this is unfortunately another one of those areas. And there are two sort of aspects to these directly attributable costs. So the first one is costs that are directly attributable to bringing this landfill site to the location and the condition that's necessary. So that means that these costs are part of the landfill site asset, and that so for example, if I can give you a few examples, it relates directly to the landfill site assets, such as the labor, the materials that you are going to use to construct the bottom liner, the cell, the stormwater drainage, etc., all those different parts of the landfill site. It may also include some other elements like depreciation on property, plant and equipment that you are using. If you're not using your own and you're renting, then that hiring cost could also be part of what you are seeing as directly attributable costs. There could also be some other general overhead costs that you are allocating as part of directly attributable costs. There may also be other separate assets that are used with the landfill site. So we're not talking about components here, but this is rather things like a guardhouse that you are erecting on the site. We've heard of things like recovery facilities for recycling, signage that maybe you have up on different places. So all of these things are seen as separate assets. It is not part of your landfill site asset. So you are going to account for them separately and apply whatever standards of GRAP apply to those assets. You are going to apply to them and account for them separately. We do have the third element as well, which is the initial estimate of the cost to dismantle and restore the asset. And that is really the costs that we are going to talk about in the next aspect, the provision for rehabilitation. So I'm not going to talk about that now. That will be part of this, the second recording. So just also to note that you are going to assess for impairment while you are constructing or developing your asset. While you are constructing and developing, there is no depreciation. That only happens after that. So we will look at that in the next slide. or 2 slides on. So in measuring your completed asset, again, the normal GRAP 17 requirements apply, cost or revaluation model. You are only then going to capitalize further costs after your asset is complete if the normal criteria are met, so that it's probable that future economic benefits or service potential will flow from those and it can be measured reliably. Just to note that there are some monitoring and inspection costs that are being incurred, and that's a requirement of the minimum requirements in the license conditions while the site is being operated. And that is part of your cost to rehabilitate. So you are going to, again, capitalize them when the recognition criteria are met. So if it enhances future economic benefits or service potential, you capitalize, otherwise you are going to expense. But this is part of the cost to rehabilitate, so it's part of your provision. Then on the next slide, I think this is probably the most important slide for me when it comes to the asset, and this is talking about the depreciation of your asset. So I think we have there the judgment that's necessary. That's quite key in this whole assessment of depreciation. In every aspect of it, are you going to have to apply judgment? So depreciation commences when the asset is available for use. So you do apply your judgment there. And we are going to look at derecognition in a slide or two, but that is when you are going to stop your depreciation. So as per the normal requirements, each significant component is separately depreciated. So again, judgment is needed to allocate your components a part of the cost as is appropriate. So maybe you have a system where each tranche or cell that you are developing, you are designating as a separate component. Otherwise, you maybe feel that it's more appropriate to have a system for leachate collection or for stormwater drainage, each of those as separate components, however you think is appropriate, or maybe a combination of both, as long as each significant component is separate. All the insignificant components are grouped together for depreciation. So the useful life, this is the period that the landfill site is available for use. So this means it has 2 separate components. Firstly, while the operation or while the landfill site is in operation, so that is the period when it is receiving waste and it is sort of open for business, if I can call it like that. And then the second part is the period over which it safely stores waste. So that is the period once you have rehabilitated and you are now for 30 years more or less required to monitor and inspect that site to make sure that the environment is protected. So both those periods are the period over which the landfill site is providing a service, and that means that that is the useful life of the landfill site. So I think this was one area where there was divergence in practice. So there may have been people who interpreted the requirements a bit differently to how we have set it out in the guideline. So as you have components, or if you have components, each of those components you are going to have to determine the useful life for. So it may be the whole useful life of your landfill site assets, or maybe some of the systems you are going to use from right from the start until the end of that post-closure monitoring and inspection period, maybe like a gas system or something like that. And then there are other parts that you maybe only use for the period over which it is in operation, or potentially only the period over which the landfill site stores waste. So you are going to have to assign a useful life. Apologies for skipping the slide there. You are going to have to assign a useful life dependent on when you are using those components. So the method, nothing strange here. I'm not really going to go into that. So just also on subsequent measurement, impairment does apply. So you are annually assessing for impairment. If you do have changes in the cost of your rehabilitation provision, so that's the next part we're going to talk about, then that does impact the cost of your landfill site asset. It's the sort of debit leg of that credit entry, if I can put it like that, or if your rehabilitation provision decreases, then it's the opposite. So just on derecognition, the last aspect of the asset is you are derecognizing when there are no more future economic benefits or service potential left in your asset. So this again requires judgment. Just to note that the tranches or cells that you may have in a larger landfill site asset, you may derecognize each of those separately when they are at capacity and can no longer receive waste. But then, well, let me put it like this, it's irrespective of whether you have, for depreciation purposes, componentized them separately. So you may not have identified them as separate components, but nevertheless, you can derecognize them separately, and you are making that assessment, applying judgment. So just lastly, that the whole landfill site should be fully depreciated by the end of the post-closure monitoring and inspection period, because that is when you have no future economic benefits or service potential left in your asset. If you do have, as part of your end-use plan, a new asset that you are going to develop from this site, that is accounted for separately, so it's not part of your landfill site asset. So this is the end of the first part of the recording that I wanted to share with you, and I'm going to then ask you to please refer to the second part of the recording for the rest of the content of the slides. Thank you.